and welcome to the ACR Journals on Air podcast. I am your host, Vicky Shamagam. Back in 2020, fellowship directors and the rest of the world pivoted to Zoom for their fellowship interview process. However, now that several years have passed and some fellows who were interviewed in those first Zoom matching cohorts are graduating, we can reflect on the process, the good, the bad, and the things that merit rethinking. The manuscript we will discuss today is Reimagining the Rheumatology Fellowship Interview, using participatory design thinking process to create a more applicant-centered experience. It was published in ACR Open Rheumatology, and a link to the manuscript and disclosures are in our show notes from today. I'm happy to be joined by the manuscript's first author, Dr. Bharat Kumar. Dr. Kumar is a double-boarded rheumatologist and allergy immunologist at the University of Iowa Clinics and clinical associate professor of medicine at the University of Iowa. He completed his undergraduate degree in political science at the University of Pennsylvania and his medical degree at Saba University School of Medicine in the Caribbean. He completed an internal medicine residency at the University of Kentucky and dual fellowships in rheumatology and allergy immunology at the University of Iowa. During his training, he also completed a master's degree in medical education and the RIMSA certification in musculoskeletal ultrasound. And as if that was not enough, Bharat is also keenly interested in medical journalism. He is the Arnold P. Gold Foundation's Humanism in Research Associate Editor and editor of The Rheumatologist, coming to a mailbox near you. Welcome to the show, Bharat.
Well, it's absolutely a pleasure to be here. It's very much a kind and a very generous introduction.
So we have a lot to talk about today, but I wanted to start with some background. Out of necessity, the 2020 fellowship interviews switched to a virtual format. But this was not virtual like virtual reality. This was a very real experience for many of our trainees. And as a fellowship director and medical educator, you saw an opportunity to learn from it. What prompted you to take this experience and reframe it as a research opportunity?
Yeah, like most great research ideas, it came out of everyday conversations. In this case, with our rheumatology fellows here at the University of Iowa. 2023 actually marked 10 years since I was on the interview trail. And so it really was a time for thinking about how things have changed. As you mentioned a little bit earlier, right, it was in real life. 2013 was in real life. And compared to our fellows who interviewed exclusively in the virtual setting here in 2023, or it was 2021 or so. As we compared notes, I came to realize that it is a totally different experience, and that is how the Scholarly Project was initiated. In particular, in our discussions, I realized that the interview process is a bit of a head fake. It's supposedly meant to help programs identify the best, that's in air quotes for the listeners, potential candidates, but its real purpose is much, much deeper and much more philosophical. It's a ritual of initiation into the field of rheumatology. I realized that it's very deeply linked to our professional identity formation and socialization. And once you start to see it in that way, you can't go back. In our institution, this year we had 150 applicants, of which we selected 32 for interviews, and we hope to match 2 fellows. Match day is still a little ways away. Clearly, the yield of the application process is very inefficient if we see it as a way to select the best, again, air quotes. Instead, when we start to view it as a learning and reflective experience for all the candidates and for us in the interviewing seats, we get a much more holistic picture of what it means to be interviewed. So that's how we start to think about it as a research opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's so true because it's really a two-way street, both the fellowship program interviewing the applicants and the applicants interviewing the fellowship program. Now, tell us about the co-authors of this manuscript. Who are they and how did they get involved?
So this is a very large list of co-authors, about 19 in all. And I'd love to talk about each of them individually, but it may be best to categorize them by their roles. In brief, there are about 5 overlapping groups. First, Dr. Kumar, that's me, Dr. Benjamin Davis, who's the chair of the Division of Immunology, and Dr. Manish Saneja, who is the Internal Medicine Residency Program Director, served as the project champions. The second group included Patricia Bruffy-Thone and Aaron Knack, who were the divisional support at the time, and so they served as kind of the project owners. The third group was Dr. Melissa Sui, as well as myself and Dr. Saneja as content experts, since we have expertise in medical education and in quality improvement. And the fourth group was comprised of our then current fellows, Dr. Alec Feng, Dr. Gatra Gariani, Dr. Aisha Iftikhar, Dr. Lemon Nee. And the last, and arguably the most important group, was the fellow candidates themselves, Dr. Dave Dimachki, Dr. Gizem Gokul, Dr. Isa Bazig, Dr. Lindsay Moy, Dr. Chen Chow, Dr. Ankita Lingamneni, Dr. Axi Patel, Dr. Gretchen Santana Severo, and Dr. Tariq Iqtidar. With that mouthful completed, I want to mention how exactly all these folks got involved. So after the match last year, during the conversation with our then current fellows, I was trying to figure out the best way to explore that kind of interview experience for our fellow candidates. At first, we just thought about talking to the fellows that matched here, but quickly realized that there's going to be an enormous bias in selecting only those people who actually selected us. That's when we started to reach out to our former fellow candidates. Now that they were matched, the power asymmetry was a little bit less, and so we felt that they could give a little bit more honest answers about what they were thinking during the interview process. And so from that, we created this really big design group and tried to be as inclusive as possible and to have the biggest tent in order to understand what does it actually mean to have an applicant-centered interview process.
Brilliant. So let's review more of the data about virtual interviews, because I think there's some data from the ACR Committee on Training and Workforce, and there's clearly pros and cons to the format. What does the data tell us?
So I give a gigantic tip of my hat to the Committee on Training and Workforce because they did a lot of work in the surveys in 2021 and 2022. In particular, I want to recognize Didem Sagan, Bethany Marston, Nina Couette, Sarah Patrizzi, and Adam Killian. And I want to just summarize their findings very briefly without talking on their behalf. But they found that this is in quotes, the virtual application season was relatively smooth with fewer challenges and disruptions than might have been expected given the rapid and profound change to previously established workflows. They also mention that, number one, virtual interviews tend to work as well as face-to-face interviews. Number two, fellows prefer shorter interview days. And number three, fellows prefer interview format flexibility between virtual and face-to-face. And that's just a summary. If you'd like to get more of the full data, you can actually find it in this thing. It comes out monthly to people. It may be in your mailbox. It's called the Rheumatologist, I think.
I know that publication.
Great. So you can find it in the July edition in 2022 and the June edition in 2021. There is a little bit of a difference between their findings and our findings, and it's not a lot. The big things is that we found that our fellow candidates were a little bit less gung-ho about virtual interviews as compared to face-to-face interviews. That's unclear if that's just random variation because there were only 9 of the folks that were part of this design process, or whether that reflects more of a deeper issue in terms of Iowa being geographically so far away from their hometowns that they didn't have a chance to see what the work culture and the environment looks like compared to face-to-face visits. But otherwise, we're actually pretty surprised by how congruent our findings were.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important, right? You're basically asking people to interview for a institution and for a role that essentially will only be done face to face and in person. And they do kind of need to get a feel for the place and the culture and the people. And it's somewhat difficult to do that in the online only format. So let's move on to the research now and talk about your manuscript. Can you outline for our listeners how you designed this study and what methodology you used?
I would absolutely love to. So we used the design thinking process, and more specifically, the IDEO Stanford 5-step design thinking process. It's composed of 5 steps: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And again, for the listeners, I'll say it again: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And these aren't strict steps, but they tend to overlap and synergize with one another. It's a little bit different than from the biomedical literature, where we think of things like qualitative or quantitative as replicable and this and that. This comes more from the design and management literature, and it uses a very distinct framework. It's very, very context dependent. And so we imagine that if we were to repeat the process this year, or if we did it for, say, nephrology, or we did it in New York, we would get very different results. So that's just a caveat I want to throw out there about the methodology we used.
And so to understand that and to clarify for our listeners, you completed the work that you're reporting in this manuscript during the 2022 to 23 interview season, and specifically people interviewing at the University of Iowa. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we conducted this process just after the interview season, just after the match. So this was after they had found out that they were going to different places, and one of them did come here. But we wanted to make sure that there was no post-interview communications between the interview and the match itself, because that is a violation of the NRMP's match code of conduct. And also, I don't think we would get any valuable information from that because of that power asymmetry.
Yeah, and so there's a great graphic, and I actually can see it on the wall behind you as we're talking. I think it's figure 1 in the manuscript with the
Yeah.
hexagons all lined up like a beehive to go through the phases of design thinking. Can you turn it into honey for our listeners' ears?
I'll absolutely try my best, but the easiest is to actually just click on the website and to expand it up. But here's what I wanted to mention. This graphic is a modification of that IDEO Stanford 5-step process. And again, it has 5 stages or steps: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And I'll go through them really very briefly. So during the empathize phase, we developed a team, a design team, and then engaged in very open-ended interviews with our current fellows, our ranked applicants, our faculty members, and coordinators. We used a rapid qualitative analysis method to get a good idea of what themes were kind of emerging from there. And again, air quotes for emerging. That led us to the define phase, where we looked at those interviews and we looked at the applicant needs, drives, and demands. Through a lot of email communications, we were able to crystallize 3 human-centered problem statements. The first was, is this a psychologically safe environment for asking questions? The second was, how can we exchange information effectively? And the third was, what do we do with all of this data? So once we got these 3 human-centered problem statements articulated, we had a series of 3 asynchronous workshops. It's asynchronous because it is extremely hard to get 19 people in the same room from across the country at the same time. This was actually the most fun part of this design thinking process, and we used some extraordinarily creative brainstorming techniques to challenge the assumptions of what it means to interview. So let me give a quick group of examples. So one technique we used was the worst possible ideas. That is, what is the worst possible way to interview somebody and try to get an idea about who they are? Should we just do it via telephone? Should we hang up abruptly? Should we ask bizarre questions? All of these different things. And then you take the converse to figure out what exactly would make the best possible idea. We also did storyboarding, so we drew little comic drawings about what it feels like to be an interviewer and what it feels like to be an interviewee. We also did some analogizing, so we looked at the experience not only as an interview, but also as kind of like speed dating, which I don't have a lot of experience about, but apparently our folks say that it's like that, or as an audition, or as a telehealth encounter. And that actually became a figure in our manuscript. And then we used diverge converge thinking, which was hooking onto a very specific idea, expanding upon it, forcing us to expand upon it, and then contracting again so it could land on another topic. So that was a lot of fun. And then when we got all these brilliant ideas coming together, we started to make the prototypes. Literally, we took whiteboards and we drew what we would see as the ideal way of having an interview process that would be applicant-centered. Depending on how you define the word prototype, we had anywhere between 5 and 18 prototypes. And then we just sequentially went through the positives and the negatives of it and came up with a final reconciled prototype. And then lastly, because there are 5 steps, we went on to test it. Now, remember, interviews only happen once a year, so we couldn't truly test it in the field until our first interview date, which was September 28th, 2023. But we did usability testing with the applicants, the fellows, the coordinators, and the faculty members to make sure there wasn't some harebrained idea that came out of a committee. And while this isn't in the manuscript, in this year, since we just completed our fellowship interviews, when we implemented it, the applicant-centered interview worked pretty well, and there were only a few minor kinks in the process that we had to solve.
Okay, so we are going to get more from you, I am sure, shortly on that data. But let's go back to some of the pieces that put this together. You use this thing called an empathy map, and it's actually a great way to visualize some of the emotions that the trainees experience during the interview process. You have a figure that displays it in the manuscript. I think it's that figure with all the little post-it note type things on it. Can you talk us through what came out of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll try to describe it as clearly as possible to our listeners because it is a little complex. In the center of the diagram, there's the fellow applicant. And around her are 4 quadrants: think and feel, hear, see, and say and do. So again, 4 quadrants: think and feel, hear, see, and say and do. And then radiating outwards, there are 50 sticky notes that are reflections of comments from those applicants. Within those sticky notes, there's 3 different colors: blue, yellow, and red, which reflect the 3 dynamics that we mentioned a little bit earlier about psychological safety, the ability to exchange information, and how do they fit this data into a bigger picture. I'll give 2 examples because it's kind of tough to just have it on audio. 2 examples. One of them is the yellow sticky note under the here quadrant, which says the stability of program director leadership. It represents a very subtle aspect of exchanging information that is heard during interviews, maybe not even noticed by the interviewers themselves. Another one is the body language of interviews. So that's a blue sticky note under the C quadrant. In this case, it reflects a visual aspect that interviewees are trying to understand the psychological safety of the interviewers and see how receptive they are to various information. And that's only 2 out of 50 of these post-it notes. But we're not quite done yet, because underneath all of this, there's a set of quotes for potential pain and potential gain that summarize all the things mentioned in the empathy map. And these represent what the fellow candidates have felt throughout their interview process, not just at the University of Iowa, but wherever they went to. So, for example, under potential pain, there is one quote: "I felt like an imposter in front of these people." And under potential gain, there was a quote that said, "I've developed connections to senior physicians." So that's kind of the empathy map as best as I can explain on an audio podcast. But for best results, probably click on the link.
Yeah. And what were the other themes that came out of the design phase after you reviewed the empathy map?
Those were kind of the big themes that were there within it. And we used more of the term dynamic, but number one, is it a safe environment for me to ask questions? Because this really is a prerequisite for any interview. If interviewees are only seeing you on the screen and they don't feel comfortable in disclosing what they're thinking or what their concerns are, then it's not going to be a very successful interview. And these are the sort of things like safety is a little bit of a loaded term, obviously, but for example, can I ask sensitive questions? Am I able to volunteer information about my personal life in the context of the environment that the program is in? That's what is encompassed within the first big dynamic. The second is, how can I effectively exchange information, which again has to do with the limitation of having just a tiny box through which you can exchange that information. So, for example, for applicants that see themselves as having weaknesses, how can they explain any weaknesses in their application? Or how can they keep the conversation going versus moving on to other topics versus having some quiet time in between? And then the last big dynamic was, how do I fit this data into the bigger picture? So, for example, under think and feel, how can I keep my application competitive after this interview? How do my strengths align with the programs? What separates this place from the other places that I've interviewed at? And the sources that they get the information from. So, for example, the fellowship program website, social media, publications from fellows and faculty, podcasts like this one, for example. Those are the major themes that came out of our processes, empathize and design phases.
And how are you moving this forward? I know you have that last graphic in the manuscript, I think it's figure 4, mapping out the final co-designed prototype. I think it's got some interesting characters inserted as the faculty. So tell us what you're proposing, and then how are you testing this scientifically with your own program, and how might you scale that to others?
Yeah, so believe it or not, the fourth doctor, a dog, a cat, a bald gentleman with a guitar, those are not the faculty at the University of Iowa. Those are just illustrating examples of that. Let me just mention real quickly about that. There are 4 major drivers of our redesign process. The first is facilitation, and this is specifically facilitation by fellows. So what we aimed to do is, instead of having the fellow applicant time towards the end of the application day or the interview day, what we did is that we moved it towards the front and we split it up. So instead of 40 minutes at the end, we kept 20 minutes at the beginning and 20 minutes towards the end. fellows are integrated as part of the welcome and the wrap up because that helps to further the sense of psychological safety that they have. The second driver is customization. So making sure that candidates are matched with faculty based on their shared interests. So for example, if the candidate really likes dogs, we will make sure that a dog-loving doctor comes first.
So that's the images in the figure.
Exactly, exactly. So on the side, and again, apologize for the smaller print, but candidates' interests and priorities in order are dogs, long scarves, guitars, and scrubs. And that's why, a dog, a guy with a guitar, the fourth doctor, and someone in scrubs are listed forwards. That's why. But yes, small print. the, the third aspect is preparation, and that is more on the back end. And that has to do with the fact that interviewers need to be briefed about the applicants beforehand. So what we did, and this is for a future manuscript, is that we developed face sheets for each of the applicants so that our faculty members could easily go through the literally reams of paper that go through an application and figure out what is the major driver motivator of the applicant and what information can we provide so that they can feel most at ease here. And that also means that beforehand, we reinforced what the NRMP guidelines are, what elements of holistic review are, and what is diversity, equity, and inclusion, so that people are very well prepared on the faculty end to interview these applicants. And the last one is hybridization, because if you remember from the ACR Committee on Training and Workforce, there was a desire for fellow applicants to have a greater sense of face-to-face interview. We tried to hybridize as much as possible in that we sent emails and letters before the interview to make them feel at ease as much as possible and to let them know that we are looking very seriously at their application. And we also sent them a very tiny tangible of corn, because that is an Iowa specialty.
Nice
Yeah,
touch.
exactly. And chocolate so that they could eat it during their interview, because it requires a lot of energy to go through 8 rounds of interview. So we sent that via hybridization, although obviously we can't do face-to-face interviews in the NRMP, and our local GME strictly frowns upon that. So those were the major drivers of this. The next part of the question was, how do we plan to test this scientifically? Well, that's TBD really, because it's very hard to test these things in a scientific way. Unfortunately, they're not like neutrophils or macrophages. But what we plan on doing, and again, this is for a future manuscript, is to detail the finality of the test process and to see, again, what exactly these fellow applicants were feeling during this newer process of an applicant-centered interview. That's TBD.
I also feel like another thing important to understand would be, 6 months into fellowship, did the applicant feel like this program was everything they anticipated? Or is it even better than they anticipated? And kind of better understanding that for individual programs would be super helpful.
Absolutely.
So I want to thank you, Bharat. That was wonderful. I think these virtual interviews have pros and cons. And given that they're pretty much here to stay, I definitely think this work is really important. I want to take a moment now to switch direction and ask a little bit about your career. You have had an exciting journey because you started your undergraduate training as a political scientist. Tell us about that training and how it set you up for success in your current role.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I did start off as a political science major, although I never really made it to becoming a political scientist, and I'm glad that I didn't become a full political scientist. My choice back then, so it was 2002, and I graduated in 2006. My choice to pursue studies in political science came out of a big desire to change the world, so that there is a greater emphasis on the aspects of justice, on equity and inclusion. So obviously, I'm not a political scientist today, but I do see a lot of politics in the world around us. And I don't just mean in Washington, D.C. or Des Moines or wherever else. Number one, I'm involved with the ACR and advocacy. A big giant shout out to Dr. Birnbaum, who was on the podcast a little bit earlier, and would encourage everyone to get involved in that, because that is what we need to do as rheumatologists. But I also see politics in the everyday aspects of being a program director. There is a lot of latent power dynamics that exist between fellows and faculty members, program directors and division directors, and all sorts of other folks. whether if we want to acknowledge that or not, this paper came out of that understanding that we really have to dissect those power asymmetries in a very transparent and inclusive manner and figure out a way how to make the world, in this case, the world of academic rheumatology, a lot more equitable and inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
There's something that I can't give too many spoilers about right now, but there will be a follow-up manuscript in progress that uses a political science framework to analyze the interview process. But maybe I'll talk about that once it's a little bit more in progress.
Oh, a teaser. Maybe we can get you back for that one.
I would love to.
So you're also one of the many, many people who completed medical training at one of the Caribbean medical schools. Would you share with our listeners that experience and how it shaped you as a medical educator?
Absolutely. It made me a lot more of an empathic human being. It's a strange in between because I am an international medical graduate and I'm proud to be an international medical graduate, but I am also a US citizen at the same time, which makes me into a minority among minorities. It shaped me as a medical educator because it made me a lot more empathic, because there was really a struggle in Caribbean medical schools. There still is, as far as I know, in order to graduate. These aren't always the most ideal situations to study in, but really you put your head into the book and you memorize that anatomy and you figure out that if you don't do that, you're not going to be able to graduate. And so there's a lot of resilience that comes out of being in a Caribbean medical school. Again, it made me a much more empathic human being. It made me understand the need to give back towards the IMG community, and something that was also published again in an ACR journal, in this case, Arthritis and Rheumatology, by Dr. Ruth Fernandez Ruiz and colleagues, is about supporting IMGs in rheumatology.
Yeah, and we had her on the podcast too.
Exactly. And I think that's extraordinarily necessary because IMGs truly are the lifeblood of the American workforce, the healthcare workforce. I think the other aspect of being a Caribbean medical school graduate is a geographic understanding of the United States. So, as a Caribbean medical student, in my rotations, I rotated throughout 8 different states during the last 2 years of my medical school career. And so it really was eye opening to see all the different ways that Americans live, that Americans die, quite honestly,
Mm-hmm.
and that Americans just exist, because prior to that, I was more ensconced within the Northeast in New York and Philadelphia. And it really opened my eyes to a whole different world of what it means to be American. And without that, I don't think I would have been nearly as comfortable in going to a place like Lexington, Kentucky, which I love beyond anything, or Iowa City, which is my current home and which I love beyond anything as well. So it made a huge, huge, profound impact upon my life.
Yeah, I really thank you for sharing that, because I think it is really important for people to hear and understand all these different experiences that people bring to the table as graduates of different medical schools all around the world. So uniquely, you are also dual accredited both in rheumatology and allergy immunology. So you kind of really ground yourself in the yin and the yang of the immune system. Tell us about the pros and cons of dual accreditation. I know it's not widely offered by many programs. So what should prospective fellows know about this option as they're evaluating their choices?
Yeah, I really am an oddity among rheumatologists and among allergists, because I'm one of about only 40 people in the United States that are dual certified in both rheumatology and in allergy immunology. I can give you all the pros, and I can give you some of the cons as well. I am a little biased, obviously, but in general, I think that this kind of training provides a lot more global understanding of the immune system. It's really strange for me that there aren't more programs that aren't aligning themselves with allergy immunology, either formally or informally. Because the more that we realize the scientific understandings of the immune system, the more we realize that autoimmunity and immunodeficiency are two sides of the same coin. And again, like for me, it's a thing that's a little bit baffling why this hasn't taken off yet, but we really hope that from the University of Iowa, we do lead a revolution in which there's greater incorporation of allergy immunology concepts into rheumatology fellowship programs. In terms of applicants who are considering this program, think very carefully indeed, because although it looks great on a CV, it's 3 years of doing 2 fellowships, which is a lot of clinical time, a lot of research time, and not a lot of downtime.
Yeah.
And so think very carefully about if that's something that you would like to do. Every year we do get some applicants to them, but many of them, they just don't have that phenotype that would be appropriate for such a rigorous training. And many of them can't articulate the reasons why they would like to do it beyond just saying, I want to have an extra feather in my cap.
Yeah, so really kind of ground your decision internally, what your mission and what your drive and what your purpose is.
Precisely. And not only on the fellow applicant side, but also on the fellowship side too. So one of the reasons why it is a little rare is that it requires extensive amounts of coordination between a rheumatology fellowship, the allergy immunology fellowship, and the local graduate medical education officer to make this real. Even here at our institution, there was a time in which it looked like this would be dead on arrival. And it only took a lot of heroic efforts on the part of our division chair, Dr. Benjamin Davis, to really advocate for this. Otherwise, it could have gone the way of so many other of the dual certification pathways that existed in different places, and just they couldn't keep up because of that onerous nature of dual certification.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of extra training, you also completed a master's degree in medical education and then also the RoomSys ultrasound certification. What prompted you to pursue those two opportunities? And again, you obviously love to learn. What advice do you have for our listeners who share that love of learning?
Yeah, regarding the master's degree in medical education, I completed that because it really became almost a meta element of being a fellow in two fellowship programs and figuring out how I can learn in two fellowship programs. In fact, my interest back then and still is about diagnostic reasoning and how people from different specialties, how they reason very differently through the same exact patient cases. My master's degree, I focused more on the psychometrics. Iowa is actually the home of the Scantron. It was actually invented not that far away from where I am right now. And so I took advantage of those opportunities to learn more about how tests are created and how we can create more valid and more reliable tests. I debated whether to get a master's degree in medical education or whether to do more informal routes of learning about medical education and such. And ultimately, I decided to do the medical education master's because I wanted to have that solid theoretical grounding in order to become a great medical educator. That was challenging because at the same time, I was also doing my ultrasound certification. And ultrasound certification, I absolutely loved doing that. I loved going through US Sonar because it really was a way how to validate a lot of our physical examination, our clinical examination. And I do ultrasound on every single clinic, not every single patient, but in every single clinic. And I consider it to be a valuable aid to understand how the human body works and occasionally does not work. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of both of them, but it did keep me very busy during those 3 years.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's more than most people do during fellowship. So, really impressive. Let's talk about your writing now, because for several years you've been editor of the Arnold P. Gold Foundation's Humanism in Research program. Tell us about that. How did you get involved and why do you write?
Yeah, so I am the associate editor for the Gold Foundation's Humanism in Research, specifically for the Research Roundup. The Research Roundup is a monthly edition that summarizes all of the peer-reviewed literature that exists regarding humanism in the medical sphere. And it is a great job because I get to read a lot of really cool articles and a lot of really cool methodologies in order to study humanism, ethics, and empathy in particular. I got involved in this about 2018 or so. I had been involved with the Gold Foundation a little bit earlier because I had applied for a grant, and then they sent this email about, if you're interested in medical journalism, you're interested in humanism, we have an opening. And of course, I applied for it, and the rest is kind of history for it. It is it is a dream come true in terms of a job because I get to be continually inspired by just the best people who are doing heroic things in medicine just to make the world a much better, much more humanistic place. And I get inspiration. So part of the inspiration for this project came out of papers that I had read for the Gold Foundation.
Yeah, so I feel like it's good to do those things that are a little bit more creative and inspirational because they kind of energize and catalyze other parts of your work. Speaking of which, I cannot let you leave this podcast without sharing with our listeners what it's been like to take the helm of The Rheumatologist. How did you get selected for that opportunity? What does it involve? And are you, by any chance, looking for any fledgling writers?
So I'm absolutely looking for fledgling writers. Absolutely. We're always looking for ways how to grow the rheumatologist and to get more perspectives and more, especially young voices, especially voices from the community to contribute to the rheumatologist. The rheumatologist is one of the most influential news magazines in the healthcare field. It's everywhere. It ranks with the New England Journal among influence for rheumatologists. And so we're always looking for fledgling writers who have good talents or are willing to collaborate with us in terms of editing for that. How I got selected, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but I did apply. I had been involved with the rheumatologist starting in my fellowship. And this does actually come along to one of the topics that you had mentioned earlier. The first column that I wrote for the rheumatologist was 7 tips for new rheumatology fellows. And it came out of that professional identity formation that comes really early into starting rheumatology fellowship and talking about what the change that occurs between residency and fellowship. And so I continued to write, continued to think about it for a while, on and off. And then eventually it came time that they had to find a new editor because these are termed limited things. And so I applied and they interviewed me, and I guess they liked me enough that I would take over for Dr. Seo. It is a really humbling experience, and it takes a lot of work and effort to come up with every single issue, but it's a labor of love. And I'm so fortunate and glad to all the people that selected me to be the rheumatologist physician editor, and I hope to live up to their expectations in the years beyond.
Oh my goodness. I think as a community, we're so lucky to have you editing that magazine and bringing the world of rheumatology to our mailboxes. So, Bharat, I just want to thank you for coming on the show today, for sharing all of your experience. Chatting with you is always a pleasure, and I really appreciate all your hard work.
I assure you the pleasure is all mine. Thank you again.
So today, my thanks also go to the COVID-era Rheumatology Fellows. You have been through a lot these past few years, and while some institutions handled things better than others, training worldwide was impacted by the pandemic and its aftermath in ways that many educators could never have imagined. As you join the ranks of card-carrying rheumatologists, I hope more of you reflect on this crucible event as a catalyst for change, and that we see more publications tackling the impact of COVID-19 as an adaptive challenge for rheumatology education. Thank you all for listening to this podcast. ACR Journals on Air is a production of the American College of Rheumatology. Please follow at ACRheum on social media. Email us at podcast@rheumatology.org and rate and subscribe to our podcast at acrjournalsonair.org or wherever you get your podcasts.